us some handhold around how we are navigating our time together in relation to climate disruption, ecological and environmental justice. So everything is connected. Everything is at stake and everything we do matters. And you showing up on a Wednesday evening, whether it's 8 o'clock or it's 5 o'clock, means a lot. And so I want to welcome you. I'm the Reverend Dr. Beth Johnson. I'm the chair of the Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice. After our presentation, you're going to get to hear more about that. But I'm going to go ahead and let us get started now. First, what I'd like you to do is take a deep breath and arrive. You might want to do that again. You arrive from the various parts of our day, the various parts of our lives, and even the various parts of ourselves. Let us collect ourselves. When I have a member of my congregation refers to the squares on Zoom as a beautiful quilt. And I love the way that our quilt is looking. And in a moment, we'll see our speaker. I want to introduce our speaker, the Reverend Peggy Clarke. Began her ministry at Community Church New York in the summer of 2019. She came there after serving as the solo minister at the First Unitarian Society in Westchester in Hastings-on-the-Hudson, New York, for 8 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in religious studies and peace studies, a master's in historical theology from Boston College. Her doctoral work was in American religious history. Reverend Clarke has served on the board of the Unitarian Universalist Association Climate Justice Initiative, Commit to Respond, the UU Environmental Justice Collaboratory, and as the chair of the Food Justice Ministry. And I had the great pleasure of serving in those places with Reverend Peggy. She was one of the UUA's observer delegates at the 2015 United Nations Climate Summit in Paris, represented the UUA at Standing Rock, and most recently at the Mexican-American border, calling attention to the crises of separated families. In 2021, she served as a UU delegate at the United Nations Climate Summit in Glasgow, and that is the origin of her talk. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that where I am in North San Diego County is the stolen land of the Luiseño Nation and the Kumeyaay Nation. I would encourage you, if you know the land that you are on, to go ahead and put that in the chat. And if you don't know the land you're on, this is an invitation for you to learn that and help us to be in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of this country. So, all that said, invite you to go ahead and you can choose your speaker view. And Reverend Peggy, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Did you want me to spotlight also?
Sure. You're spotlighted for me, so.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's really a delight to be here. Beth and I have been friends for years. And so, pretty much when she asks me to do something, the answer is yes. And then I just figure it out. I am coming to you from New York. We are on the land of the Lenape people. And it is 8 p.m. I'm going to just be completely upfront with you. It's 8 p.m. on a Wednesday. I'm a mom. I've got 2 dogs. I've got a husband. I've got a whole thing going on behind me. So while they're all promising to be quiet, you just really never know. And my internet has been spotty for 2 days. So, of course it has. I'm just keeping it real for you. that is what's real. Nonetheless, I'm here and I'm very, very happy to be here. I am the senior minister at Community Church of New York, which is in Midtown Manhattan. I've been there now for 2.5 years. And I was the observer delegate in both Paris and Glasgow, and that is what I'm going to be talking about. I was told that I have until just before 9 o'clock, including the Q&A. So I'm gonna be a really good New Yorker and talk fast. That's my plan. uh, and I also don't want to assume information that you don't have. So I'm going to explain some things, and maybe it's stuff you already know, and maybe it's really, interesting and important information for you. I'm going to start with just kind of before Paris. Like, how did we get to Paris? And then what happened between Paris and Glasgow? And then what are we supposed to do? And then Glasgow, and what are we supposed to do now? That's my plan. So in 1992, the United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro essentially created what they called the Conference of Parties as a supreme decision-making body for the United Nations. And it's for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is way too long. It's the UNFCCC. But the idea was they are going to gather a body together every year as decision makers related to climate change. In 1994, they ratified that. 196 countries ratified it. And we have had what is called COPs, the Conference of Parties, every year since then. You might recognize some of the names. There was the Kyoto Protocol. There was what's often considered a failed attempt in Copenhagen. And it brings us sort of to Paris, which was COP21. And the idea really was that Copenhagen in 2009 really failed, right? Just didn't meet the moment. And between 2009 and 2015, there were these new strategies being put in place. How do we make it so that a COP not only has authority, but has some staying power and has some teeth? How do we infuse ambition into the project? It was a huge gamble, and yet what ended up happening ultimately is that Paris was really very successful. So let me explain to you what a COP is. When you show up at a COP, there are essentially 3 parts. Conference of Parties, again, COP has 3 parts. One part is the meeting, this official meeting of United Nations delegates who represent nations. So every nation has a team of people. The United States sent 50 to Paris. Some countries had as few as 20. I think 50 was probably the largest. But these teams come together. So you're talking about a lot of people, and they are negotiators. And there's a primary negotiator, and then this team of people around them. So there's all these official meetings. That's one part of it. Kind of surrounding them is this conference, the sort of convention experience at the highest levels. So it's all of the people in each of those parties who aren't currently in meetings, who are sort of around and just doing things, having side meetings, press conferences, going to side events, which are generally presented by scientists on new material. And then NGOs. There are all of these non-governmental organizations also sending groups. So I was there as an observer delegate at one of these NGOs, and we have access. We are what's inside of what's called the blue zone. We have access. So that's 2. So one part is the official meeting. One part is this kind of conference around it. And then the third part would be the public. The public are not allowed in. There's something, this building is called the blue zone, and no one comes in, surrounded by soldiers, really. But the public play a really vital role in the conference. There's a huge green zone where the public goes and people hang out, but there's also people who they rally and they demonstrate, and activists who just surround this space all the time. So those are the 3 parts, and all 3 parts are critical in the success of a COP. I'll also say that at a COP, you have diversity, really like you don't ever get anywhere in the world. This is every single country on the planet represented in a single space. It's every single language. It's every religion. It's mind-boggling how really just exciting it is to be in the space. And there's a sense that everyone feels that. Even the people who sort of do this for a living have this experience of awe of just being together in this kind of space. One of the things that's really wonderful about it for NGOs is that there's access to people in power that we just don't get normally, right? You just don't. Someone like me, I don't have that. But we are then in this space. It's incredibly hard to get in. There's security like I can't even quite describe. But once you're in, there's this sense of, of access. So while there are official things happening in this interior space, the activists in the NGOs, people like me, are creating a mood that elevates both urgency and puts an enormous amount of pressure on people to be doing the right thing. They're just not isolated. They're really in conversation, in relationship, and it's a 2-week conference. And it's very intense 2 weeks. So that's what a COP is. In Paris, so we really do have to talk about Paris in order to understand Glasgow. When Paris started, so it's 2015, Barack Obama is the president. Obama understood that he did not have, he had an enormous amount of international clout, but he didn't have a lot of national clout, right? And he had, in 2015, he had a Republican Congress that was in no way trying to hide that whatever he did, they were going to make unsuccessful, right? I mean, Mitch McConnell came out and said, it is my job to block the Obama agenda, whatever it was. So that was sort of an interesting challenge for him. Here he was a critical leader in the international stage on climate, but had very little power, or, not the power everyone else wanted him to have here in his own country. So what he did was he did some really, really wonderful strategic things. And the part that relates here is that he invited faith leaders to the State Department and to the White House. And we had this 2-day meeting, and we met with the Secretary of State, we met with Secretary of Energy. There were like 90 faith leaders invited. And the basic message of these 2 days was, we are willing to negotiate with you as the American team, the American climate team, if you're willing to tell our story when you get back. We need for you to herald our success because you have a moral voice and you will help us to move this forward when we have such a block in Congress. So that was the deal that we made. And it worked. What it meant was that when we got to Paris, we had real access. We were our own team, right? The faith leaders then all knew each other, and we were getting daily briefings from the American, from the envoy and the deputy envoy, and we met with the negotiators, and we were able to really bring our issues, and they were able to say, this is what we're pushing for, and we could say that we're going to support that, or we're not going to support that. This is what we need for you to be pushing for instead. So when we get to Paris, there are sort of 3 issues. The first one is, can this happen at all? It seemed like what everyone was showing up for was some kind of real climate agreement that was going to meet the moment. And there were several countries there. Saudi Arabia was at the front of the line saying, let's just postpone. This isn't working. We don't have enough time. We need, 5 more years. Give us 5 years to really think about this, and we'll come back to the table with something to talk about. So the first thing that we needed to worry about is this even going to happen? The second thing was, can we get these countries to agree to a 2-degree goal, right? Warming of no more than 2 degrees Celsius. That was on the table. And the third was, can we create an agreement that every country can get through their own internal mechanisms? And this was particularly a problem for democratic countries like our own that had to get through something like a Republican Congress that was really committed to making sure that didn't happen. So the conversation during Paris, the first week felt kind of deadening and frightening. And the Saturday at the end of that first week, our envoy, whose name was Todd Stearns, said that on the one hand, he felt like this was never going to happen. He was actually feeling really defeated. And on the other hand, he knew that he'd felt this way before about a lot of things, and it turns around anyway. So he said, we're going to figure this out. What ended up happening was yes, there was an agreement. Yes, 2 degrees was absolutely on the table. And yes, they figured out a way to get it through even difficult governments like our own. The 2 degrees, they actually got not just 2 degrees, but the language in the document says less than 2-degree increase, less than 2 degrees. That was the goal, which was astounding. When we started, how are we ever going to get to 2 degrees? They were talking 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees was on the table. It just felt like we're never getting anywhere. And yet there we were. The language says less than 2 degrees. And I'm telling you, that has a lot to do with the public and all of the internal pressure from those NGOs. When you walked in that building, it said 1.5 degrees on every wall. People were painting it onto the walls, 1.5 degrees, because really 3 degrees is deadly, 2 degrees is deadly, 1.5 is frankly really dangerous. So I'm going to get back to that, but just to say, so yes, there was an agreement. Yes, less than 2 degrees, so we got that. And then they came up with a plan, and I'm telling you this for a reason. They came up with a plan that people back at home here in the United States said was a failure, but was genius. They decided that it wasn't going to be a treaty. They decided, now this is, people were up in arms, there's no legal requirements, this isn't a treaty. But President Obama said, I'm never getting a treaty passed. Our Congress will never vote for a treaty. Instead, this has to be an agreement, which is what it's called, the Paris Agreement. It has to be an agreement, and it has to be grounded in nationally determined contributions. It can't be decided by the COP. The group can't decide what it is that's happening here. Every country has to come up with it for themselves. Nationally determined contributions, which is just individual climate plans. Everyone has their own individual climate plan, which in the United States is perfect, right? We love individual plans. We love to say, this is ours. And that's what happened. He came up with this plan. People were so critical, but it really survived the Trump years. I think someone's off mute. I'm going to stop for a minute. Can we just mute you?
I think that did it. Folks, just remind you to put yourself on mute if you don't know where the mute button is. It's at the bottom ribbon of your screen on the left side, and it looks like a little microphone, and it says mute.
Thank you. So we have NDCs, nationally determined contributions. We have an agreement, not a treaty. And then the other thing that we got was 100 billion pledge to poor nations with help, just for help with adapting to a new climate. That's what we got. Now, when we went into Paris, when we were showing up there, the planet was on target for reaching an increase of temperature of 6 degrees. When we left Paris, we were on target for reaching an increase of temperature by 3.7 degrees Celsius. So that was significant. Without Paris, it has been determined that we would today be on target for a 7.4 degree increase. So Paris was incredibly successful. It absolutely moved us in the right direction. It was a complicated plan, but it was a plan that survived, and it survived President Trump coming in and deregulating and trying to move a lot of these things backwards. It didn't matter. Again, it wasn't a treaty. Nationally determined contributions meant that there were a lot of public-private partnerships. So he couldn't undo a lot of that. It actually really held up under the pressure that the Obama administration knew was coming. Before Glasgow, the next thing that happened was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, which came out in August of 2021. I don't know, did you all read that? Am I the only person who read that all the way through? Okay, doesn't look like some of you read it. Okay. So the report was incredibly depressing. this is a report that comes out. We've had 6 of them since 1990. It comes out in 3 parts. There's science, and then there's an impact statement, and then there's a mitigation statement. And every year, every time it comes out, every few years, it builds on the last, and we're getting more and more clear about the models and more clear about what's happening with climate. And I'm sure I don't have to go over with any of you about what's happening and why this is so terrifying. But that report was stunning, and I expected it to be stunning. I think everyone expected it, but there was something about just reading the science and understanding just how dangerous it was. And there were some things that were really clear. So remember, this is August, right before Glasgow, which is in October. Some of the things that were really clear. One is that if emissions aren't cut by half by 2030, we will pass a turning point that we cannot reverse. So it's not like it'll get bad and then we cut emissions later and then we go back. There's no going back, which was really, just stunning. It was a stunning thing to read. Now, the scientists said that they knew it was stunning, but they felt like they'd said some things that were stunning before, that they'd been saying some things that were really alarming and that no one was reacting. And so while they put this out with all the data to prove their point, they also say that they'd gotten sort of used to being ignored. The United Nations, though, called it a code red for humanity. And what the report did was say this debate is really over. There's no more debating. We're at the time for leadership. That is all there is. That there is no question that the extreme weather that you see in the news, the floods, heat, drought, storms, that's all connected to climate change. That there is no that's 2021. We're like 9 years. Today it's 2022. We're 8 years from no turning back. They also did a really interesting thing of assessing back 2,000 years to kind of prove that this is unprecedented. This is absolutely happening because of human action in these last 150 years. We also learned, that's in August, we learned in September that while everyone is supposed to be working to reduce emissions, we were actually it looked like we were about to be increasing emissions by 16%. So that's September. So August comes this really depressing report. And then September is time for nationally determined contributions. Every country is supposed to submit their numbers. This is what we're doing to ensure that we get to our goal of less than 2 degrees. And while everyone is submitting, they're doing a stock tick. They're like counting up all of the emissions and all the carbon that's going in the atmosphere and realize we're going up 16%. That's when all is said and done, we're actually not going down, we're going up. And that was specifically because Brazil, Mexico, and Russia were predicting increases, not decreases. So that was terrifying. So we understand that we're in a really terrible situation, and we understand that the nations that had promised in Paris that they were going to get serious about, really doing something, weren't really doing something. And that's really how, Glasgow starts. It started with this feeling of like, what are we doing? Countries were submitting promises related to 2050. The report is saying by 2030 it's too late, and they're saying, well, we promised by 2050 we'll get something done, which, by the way, is nothing. 2050 just means that I'm passing this on to somebody else. Like, the next politician will deal with this. I'm going to make some bold promises for something someone else is going to have to figure out. They're kicking the can. There's nothing that's really happening there. And this report is saying there are tipping points, and we are there. And in fact, it also listed for us the tipping points. So there are, sort of depending on who you ask, between 7 and 12 tipping points, but the idea was that these tipping points um, are irreversible, will speed up climate change. And originally it was thought, you need an increase of something like 5 degrees. And this report said, no, actually, some of these are happening already. And some of them are going to happen like at 2 degrees, maybe 2.5 or 3 degrees, which is what we're on target for. So things like the melting of the Greenland ice sheets, that's happening. Greenland ice sheets they've already lost 4 trillion tons of ice. That happens between 0.08 degrees. We are currently at 1 degree. We've already increased temperature by 1 degree. So we've already hit the point at which the Greenland ice sheet is melting, and we're seeing it melt. That is already happening. Right? We've already warmed enough for that to happen. Other ice sheets, there's a whole list of things that I don't have time for. I'm not going to go through, but they are all at like the 2 degree, 2.5 degree, maybe 1 degree, 1.5 degree, that they're all of those tipping points get hit. So that's how we go into Glasgow with this like what is happening? Paris seems so successful, and 5 years later, what has happened? It's only gotten worse. It just felt people felt so defeated. So we showed up not really knowing what was going to happen. Glasgow, by the way, was supposed to happen in 2020, but because of COVID, so one of the Paris agreements was that we would revisit this every 5 years, and then it was pushed to 6, and that was one of the problems. Like, it's already been 6 years. We're only at the first meeting after Paris. A COP happens every year, but this was the first real meeting of trying to follow through on the Paris agreements. We're only at the first meeting. We're already 6 years later, and things have only gotten worse. So expectations were really low for Glasgow. And yet I'm going to say Glasgow ended up being transformative. It was remarkable, and it was not enough. We walked in with, so we went to Paris with the idea that we were on target to increase by 6 degrees. When we left, we're on target to increase by 3.7 degrees. When we left Glasgow, we were on target to increase by 2.4 degrees. So that was significantly better. And there is actually some chance, we're waiting for the recalculation, it could actually be 1.8 degrees. There were these side agreements, and no one is really clear if the side agreements were calculated or not. So it could be 1.8 degrees. So that's significant. That doesn't get us out of the danger zone, but that puts us in the right game at least. The tone at Glasgow was very different from Paris, very, very different. The tone was one of alarm. It was urgent. It really mirrored the report that came out, the IPCC report that was like, that's how Glasgow felt. Everyone was like, what are we going to do? Which was not Paris. Paris had this sort of laid back, there was a baker, literally there's a baker in the middle of it making bread, and it felt joyful and exciting. And Glasgow felt like, what are we all doing here? The politicians were really mirroring the science. The policy was mirroring the science, which is how it's supposed to be, right? It felt right. It felt like they were in alignment. And the text recognizes that this is a critical decade, that this is what is supposed to happen, that we have to have emissions by 2030. The text says, we understand what has to happen. The language, so going into Paris was like, can we get to 2 degrees? The language in Glasgow was, we have to resolve ourselves to 1.5 degrees. At 1.5, we really cannot get past 1.5, which is so different. Right? 1.5 is suddenly the top of what's acceptable. Whereas going into Paris 6 years earlier, we weren't sure we could get to 2 degrees. I would also say in Glasgow, the moral voice was heard. It was so clear. They centered, the whole way it was designed, they were centering these personal stories. People were telling their stories. They were telling these really powerful stories about what life was like. This wasn't one of the official stories, but I ended up talking with a woman from Ghana who was, essentially, in Ghana, girls have only recently been going to school. And one of the ways, one of the reasons that they can go to school is because there have been advances that keep the work at home much later and allow women to do the work that they want to do on their own and allow their daughters to go to school. And that's being reversed um, because now there is no water. It takes so much longer to get water that the women need help to get water. So they keep their daughters home from school and they go and spend their days looking for water. So we're not just talking about an immediate crisis, we're talking about a generational crisis. There are other stories. I spoke with a woman from Bermuda who works in domestic violence, and she said she wasn't interested in climate change. She just felt like that wasn't her issue. This is her issue. She does domestic violence until she realized that the hurricanes that were coming through Bermuda were creating an economic situation that was making domestic violence significantly worse. And she realized that if you don't address climate change, then you're not addressing women's rights. So for both women, those stories, and Glasgow was filled with those stories, people telling their stories in a way that they didn't in Paris. People were just sitting with each other and telling these stories. I'll say, Boris Johnson had mocked climate activists, but he hosted Glasgow and completely changed his tune about it. It just felt like everyone had shifted into this space of like, we understand this has to happen. And the document that was created was far more expansive than Paris. It included biodiversity, included nature-based solutions, it included oceans. It was a holistic approach, and it was more inclusive. The document called on the activists to say activists played a very real role in this. The activists were outside, they were chanting and making life sometimes difficult to get through, but they were young. There was, this young group, teenagers who were just saying, this is our future. And that moral voice absolutely got through. It was a different kind of conversation inside. The role of Indigenous people, calling on women's involvement, recognizing a need for public and private sector relationships. There was language around just transition, and that was never talked about in Paris. So what does a just transition look like? So the way we talk about climate has changed, and everyone was on board. So some of the things that happened in Glasgow. So adaptation. So we generally think about this in terms of adaptation, mitigation. Well, those are sort of in Paris, those were the two. In Glasgow, we added loss and damage, but adaptation, the one thing that came out of Paris was this $100 billion promised. In Glasgow, it was sort of decided that it was recognized that $100 billion wasn't anywhere close to enough to help poorer countries participate and really adapt their economies and their lifestyles. There was a recognition that people had already lost their homes, that terrible things had already happened. And at the same time, I'd say those poor countries weren't terribly interested in being given charity. They were really very interested in having their own voices heard. They really wanted to be part of the solution more than they were interested in how much money was on the table. But the money on the table was important. It was a way of really acknowledging that there are some countries that are creating a problem and there are some countries that are suffering from that problem, and that there's a terrible imbalance there. And recognizing that and saying that out loud that was different. That wasn't something that was talked about in Paris. We didn't get to as many promises, or we got to promises around adaptation, sort of helping around adaptation without any specifics, the how and the, how are we going to do this? Where are we going to do this? How does this really happen? It's really interesting to me, and maybe you all want to talk more about it, but I don't necessarily understand why are the wealthy countries so concerned about committing to helping poorer countries? And I understand in some way it's just capitalism and no one wants to let go of what they have, but there is an intransience, like there's this intensity about the no. And I don't know, are we afraid of legal liability? Are we afraid that it'll just never end? Are we just insensitive to it? But that's an interesting question for me. The other thing is mitigation. So we got to a total of 2.4 degrees. That's not good enough. I will say that one of the things that was happening at Glasgow was, can we not meet in 5 years? Like, it's just too long. Can we maybe talk about 3 years? So in the end, they agreed to meet in 1 year, which was amazing. So the next COP, now it's in Egypt, and everyone's coming back to the table to finish the conversation. How do we get enough money? How do we not only get more money, but how do we create the mechanism by which countries access the money that they need? I feel like I have way too much to say, and I'm going to try and wrap it up so that there's time for questions and answers. One of the big concerns that people had was China. So let me say this about China. There was a concern that China did not show up, and China didn't show up. But China tends to underpromise and overdeliver. They, in fact, have an internal plan for climate neutrality. They are actually moving faster than most countries are moving. So there was a lot of talk about China, and I think that without a lot of kind of sense that China is actually moving things forward in a way that other countries aren't. And I'm going to wrap up with this. I think that what Glasgow did for us was say that we understand, we are now ready to make something happen. What COVID did for us was show us that we actually have the money and we have the ability to move very, very quickly to respond to emergencies. Glasgow is saying, we get it, there really is an emergency, and then this virus has told us, and we also know how to respond to it. There is the possibility of a world beyond all of this that's actually quite gorgeous, that is really grounded. It's moving capitalism aside and reprioritizing this holistic way of living in relationship with Earth and with each other in a way that doesn't prioritize growth and doesn't prioritize exploitation, and instead prioritizes relationships. There's something that's on the other side of this that I think is motivational in a way that maybe even the fear of what, of climate change, it's inspirational. It's wildly exciting. And when I think about it, I think that is the world I want to live in. So on the one hand, I want to say what's happening is really awful. People are starting to get it. They're starting to listen. Public outcry is absolutely necessary in the conversation. And let's really imagine the other thing, the world that we really want, the possibility of something that's completely different. Because I think that thing is absolutely worth working for. I'm going to stop. I feel like I've talked too much. I didn't get to a lot of stuff because, that's the way that life is. But maybe I can answer some questions, or there are things maybe you all want to talk about.
Whoa. Let's take a breath. Let's thank Reverend Peggy. Amazing and wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure we have some questions and we will take them. I have a question, but I'm going to open it up first. And what I would like to do is have what's called a progressive stack. And that is, if there are people on this meeting, in this Zoom, who identify as people of color, please go ahead and we would invite you to speak first. I can't presume to know the identities of folks. So I'm going to just give it a minute. That's not to put anyone on the spot, but it is to prioritize. So give it a minute. And if you are inclined as a person of color to go ahead and speak up or put a question in the chat, would love that. And I'm going to give it another few seconds. Perfect. Yes, absolutely. A great talk. Always eloquent.
Someone has a question they sent just to me, and it's actually something I had wanted to get to. So if there aren't other questions, I'd actually really love to answer.
Go ahead, and then we'll,
Although if you wanted to go to the progressive stack, if there are other people who have, looks like someone's
I
raising a
don't,
hand.
I, okay, let's see. Let me check with Joel. If you identify as a person of color, your hand is raised. Come off mute. If not, then you are on stack, and Peggy is going to answer the question that she had in her private message, and then I see another question from Reverend Sherry. So, Joel, if you're a person of color and would like to come off stack, come off
No,
mute.
sorry. Just put me on the stack. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. Peggy, you want to take that question?
Yeah, so the question is really about the role of religious community. And so there are two parts of this. One part is raising this moral voice. And I really want to say, as much as an activist, I've been an activist forever, I often feel like, who am I talking to? Why am I doing this? Who's listening to this? So I want to say first, the moral voice is necessary, and the people making the rules are listening and are moved by it. But there's something more than that. When we start to shift into this new way of being, community is going to be critical in how we live a new and different life. And communities today, I've just recently have been putting this question out all over the place, like, where's your community? People don't necessarily experience community in their neighborhoods. They may experience it at work, but often they experience it through religious community, through their spiritual, those, church, synagogue, it's their religious homes that they feel most grounded. I think that's where we start to build real resilience. That building resilient communities is a spiritual practice, and we will do that together with great intentionality when we are willing to take the risk of being in relationship with each other with that kind of authenticity. But if we are going to rebuild society in a way that will promote the greatest health for all beings, then we are going to do it in loving kindness with each other. And that's going to happen in religious community. I don't imagine that we are going to move forward or be successful in the way that we need to be if we aren't grounded in spiritual practice. So I think that that's a critical way that religious community is necessary moving forward.
Beautiful. I'm glad that this is recorded because I want to grab that thing you said about building resilience in religious community as a spiritual practice, and there was more to it, and I'm going to get it and transcribe it. So thank you for that. There is a question in the chat that I saw first, and that is, who enforces the agreements and how?
Good question, because nobody and no how. I mean, a lot of international diplomacy is about reputation. So one of the things that happened to us in 2016 and sort of over the course between 2016 and 2020 is that the United States ordered away a lot of our reputation. Internationally, we all rely on each other. International commerce is critical. And when countries can't be trusted, they also can't enter agreements of all kinds. Trade agreements are necessary. So clout has a lot to do with it. For instance, when we entered the Kyoto Protocol and then stepped out of it, the United States lost an enormous amount of trust, and it took a long time to rebuild. And Obama did a lot of good work, and then around climate really moved himself out as a leader and brought other leaders in. In fact, the reason Paris was so successful is because part of the strategy after Copenhagen was getting the United States to take leadership. He did take leadership. He created all these side agreements. He brought people in. He made agreements. But ultimately, what happened in Paris was not a treaty. There was nothing legal binding it. So that there was an agreement about how we would leave it, how you go in and how you get into it and how you leave it. President Trump pulled us out. Now, I will say he pulled us out according to the agreement. He didn't just say, we're leaving and then be done with it. He said we're leaving and waited, I think it was, I think the agreement is 13 months or maybe 23 months. So there's a whole process of leaving, and he actually engaged the entire process of leaving, which is what ultimately kept us in it, because by the time we came around to the date of leaving, he was out and Biden put us right back in and said, never mind. But we lost an enormous amount of trust in that process, an enormous amount of trust. And when we got to Glasgow, we were not trusted and we were not the leaders. We did not, there was a real acknowledgement of, we have to rebuild this. It's going to take a lot of time. It was very fast, took us no time to lose it, and will take a lot of time to build it back. But so nothing keeps us in it. This is all based, it's a covenant. It's all based on relationship. If you want to be in a relationship with me in 10 years, you're going to be in a relationship with me today, and we're going to build this up together. And over time, that's how it works. And it doesn't work.
Okay, thank you so much. And Joel, you had your hand up.
Yes, I do. Hi. Sorry. So my question is about, I find it frustrating that people around me focus a lot on lifestyle changes to fix this problem. If I become vegan, if I don't travel, if I don't eat meat, if I drive an electric car, that will fix the problem, and it won't. And I get actually kind of agitated when I'm saying this, but the carbon footprint thing was actually created by BP to throw the onus onto us. It's our problem. BP actually created the carbon footprint concept. So I don't mind that people do good things in their lives, and I think it's great that we do. And I also drive a semi-electric car and eat semi-vegetarian and all that good stuff. But my question is about, where do we go? What can we as individuals do? And I feel like you've started to answer this already with your referring to the religious communities. What can we do as individuals? How can we help?
So I think what you're saying about carbon footprint is important. And it's important for a few reasons. One of them is we have to understand collective action over individual action. With that said, we have tremendous collective power in our purchasing habits. So for instance, I also drive a hybrid. When I bought my hybrid, there were very few on the market. There were hybrids on the market though, because so many people were saying, that's what we want. We want more options. So now today, if I go buy a new car, I have plenty of choices around what kind of hybrid. And in fact, I could get an electric car because there are choices now. So while it doesn't, my particular driving habits are not actually going to change the world, my collective, when I join a collective of people who are putting pressure on corporations want to make money and they do respond. So there is something to that. There's, if we all collectively ate less meat, then they wouldn't be tearing apart the Amazon in the way that they are, right? So these things are all related. At the same time, my own personal, if I'm the number of bottles that I might personally drink of water aren't going to transform the world. But if I were to say, join other people in saying together, we're going to shift the culture so that instead of that, we now use, I use a glass instead of plastic, like that there are ways to change things. The other things that we really can do, there's a culture shift that has to happen, right? So I'm talking about like international policy, but when we bring it down to like, how do I live today? There's a culture shift, and we need to be building or growing, flexing a new muscle. So for instance, when I go to Trader Joe's on Mondays, I text my neighbor and say, what can I get you? And we start to build up a new way of living. So we don't all go to Trader Joe's in my little neighborhood, right? We go for each other. We pick things up for each other. We start to build up a new way of living. And I think that that's a lot of what it is that needs to be happening here. We need to get very intentional about what does a new world look like. The food system is critical in the new world. How do we, and I know that this sounds exhausting, but like, how do we grow some of our own food and stop relying on a global food market? And not for ourselves, but how do we, in our communities, how do we collectively start thinking about shifting away from the easy way that we live, which is that we go to Trader Joe's and instead grow strawberries in our backyards for each other? I'm probably even forgetting your question because it's getting late and I've literally been on Zoom since 9 o'clock this morning. But I think that what I'm trying to say is that there are cultural, intentional ways for us to change the way that we live that do actually work. And I think will serve us well going forward.
Thank you for that, Peggy. I see it as I was going to say I see it as a both and I'm becoming really even dissatisfied with both and another binary. It's yes, yes, yes. So there's also a shift in consciousness that happens when we make those choices. Yes, they're not enough, but there's a shift in consciousness when we do that, and shifting consciousness by itself isn't enough, right? It takes all of these pieces. So thank you for that. I had a
One of the things,
okay.
one of the things that happens is that when countries are sitting at the table, they get afraid of being ambitious because they believe that the implications for what they're doing will affect corporations in their countries. And corporations in their countries are going to leave because they won't be able to make enough money and they're going to go somewhere where things are easier. Corporations, though, in reality, respond to consumer pressure. In this country, one of the things that Obama did was go to Google and Apple and Microsoft and ask them to make commitments. They were willing to make those commitments because they understood that their consumer base actually wanted them to. Their consumer base had told them that by making choices along the line that were more climate conscious. So I hear, what Beth is saying, that we create this new consciousness and we really create a new culture that starts to build on itself. So corporations start to change their behavior, and then governments start to become more ambitious in what they imagine is possible, and corporations respond, and people start living differently as we create something new with each other. Okay, sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Peggy. I wanted to circle back to the comment that you made about the resistance of rich companies to helping poor countries. And I'm wondering if those poor countries are generally countries where the residents are people of color, or black or brown or indigenous people, and the role that racism plays in climate, environmental racism, and even just the mindset of deserving, not deserving.
Yeah, so we are talking about the global South, where most of the, at least the more immediate, the current crisis is living out. So I do ask myself often, like, what is the resistance? I mean, if you're talking about all the nations, all the wealthy nations, right now they've pledged $100 billion, which is stunningly low when you think about both what's needed and how much money is actually available. So that is the question I keep asking myself, like, what is it that would keep us so stingy? And I think that the reality that white rich countries aren't valuing the lives of poor countries, people of color. I mean, I think that that's a very real motivation. There's this insensitivity to the life that's lost. And it is probably an unconscious bias, but if we don't start making it conscious, we're not ever going to address it. That we have to value, and Frank, I mean, I've said this to some of those of you I know, I'm sure to Beth, but there's this hierarchy of value of life in this country, and we value life. We value white, male, Christian, able-bodied, wealthy, educated life more than we value other life. And that goes all the way down to, at the very bottom of the hierarchy is, soil and trees. We look at trees and say there's nothing there. I mean, so people of color, the global South, that's all, that isn't life that we value in the same way. I think that's the very real answer to the question.
And the nature of the colonizer. So Phil raised his hand. I'm going to do a quick check at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock on the East Coast. Reverend Peggy, do you have time for one more question?
I have one more, and then I've got a bedtime.
And
I've got to
go.
see too.
I know. Phil, do you want to ask your question? You get the.
I'll make this quick then. So, Reverend Peggy, given that these agreements have not really had teeth in the sense of, consequences if nations don't follow through, do you think that is likely in a future agreement?
I'll say that I was really surprised by Glasgow insofar as people seemed so much more willing and honest than they were in Paris. So right now it feels like that's a huge stretch. Like saying that there's going to be a consequence is a huge stretch. And at the same time, the urgency I just experienced tells me that people are moving faster than maybe it appears. So yeah, I think that it is possible that nations will be willing to enter with some kind of consequence. And with that said, I mean, I'm saying that out loud. I'm thinking, really, I mean, China almost never wants to, they don't even want to enter the agreement because they really just want to work independently. India, Brazil, Russia, and the United States tend to be the highest emitters and the most resistant to anybody telling them what to do. So it seems like a real stretch, and I've seen really surprising things happen. So I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to give you a hard no.
Well, Reverend Peggy, we are going to let you leave on this note. I knew this would be beautiful and intense and enlightening. So I just want to thank you. Give Reverend Peggy some
Thank you
love,
all so much.
Some heart.
Sorry if I talk too fast.
No worries. Give my love to the family. And if the rest of you want to stay on, we can talk a little bit about ICEJ and then we'll close. All love. And did you see Reverend Sarah Gibb Millspa's here too? Oh, Peggy's gone. But Reverend Sarah Gibb Millspa's here as well. Thanks, everyone. We've got some folks. Hi, Sarah. Got some folks that needed to leave, but we did want to leave a little bit of time here to, I have a sense that we could, this is my sense, that we could have a discussion for another hour, and we're not going to do that. But we will we'll take Peggy's talk, the questions that came up, and thanks, Reverend Sarah, and then figure out, what we want to do with that and how we might want to make our way and how ICEJ can hold space for some of these questions. So, yeah. I'm going to turn it over to Diane for announcements. And by the way, we see your comments in the chat. There were lots of comments, and we will hang on to them too.
Sorry, I thought we were going to do something. Oh,
What did you think we were going to do?
no, I thought we were going to go into another conversation
Oh, sorry.
with
No.
more specifics, but that's another time, right?
Yes, yes. that's another-
Great. So I need to reduce this so I can add, I'm sorry, I'm getting out of full screen here. Okay, so for any interested persons of faith, however you define that, to join us via Zoom, we would like you to contact Phil Petrie. And Phil, do you want to put your information in the chat? The next meeting is Tuesday, March 8th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. And it's always a wonderful conversation. The Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice will be developing local resources for green faiths, sacred seasons for climate justice between March 19th and May 6th. This is a time when 5 major sacred days or seasons and the spring equinox and Earth Day are recognized. So more on that is coming up. San Diego 350 offers many, many opportunities to act on climate, and you can find their information on their calendar. And maybe we could get the link there as well so people can copy it. And I think there's a chance that Phil might be sending out something after this that provides all these links as well. So we just want to use many ways to let you know about the good things going on. Another interfaith opportunity is through Interfaith Power and Light's Sacred Trust, Our Children's Rights to a Livable Future. And it is a Climate Action Week series set for April 22nd to May 1st. Activities include ways to safeguard our Earth for future generations and highlight our faith call to respond with bold and just solutions to climate change. You can get informational packets from them. They are free starting in March. And let's see, maybe I can really quickly put this in the chat, unless Phil does that. I don't know. Anyway, very soon, ICEJ will send out a link to view the recording of the California Poor People's Campaign Climate Crisis event from November 2021. It features eco-activists Tom Goldtooth, William Barber III, and Jacqueline Patterson, who's one of the neatest women in the world. I love her to death. This is a stirring and informative event that is not to be missed. And just check periodically with the website for upcoming interfaith advocacy opportunities. Thanks.
Nicely done.
And Beth, can I just piggyback just for a sec?
Sure.
Because things are evolving as we go here. So we will actually have a watch party for that event that Diane was just talking about. But I didn't get Diane the proper information. So anyway, it's I've seen the whole thing of that Poor People's Campaign climate event, and it is really worth watching. I recommend it to everybody.
It includes folks who work Glasgow. It includes folks from the indigenous communities, so you can, look for that. I just want to thank everyone for being here. That was so much good information, and I love how Reverend Peggy ended on the note that we are called to imagine the community that we wish to see and live the community we wish to build. And we may not see it in our lifetimes, but it doesn't mean, we might not see it at all, but it doesn't mean that we don't try, because it's through that we are ennobled and that we live that vision of love that we are called to. So as you go forth from this place, what about involvement in the Parliament of the World's Religions? Thanks for this. It's always wonderful when the Parliament happens. It's happening in Chicago, where it began in 1893. So thanks for putting that information in there, Reverend Sherry. And I think that's it. Why don't we call it done? Feel done? Thanks, everyone. Deep bow.
Thanks, Beth. Good to see you all.
Bye-bye. Hi, Judy. Glad you're here. Bye, everyone.
Good to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.